Okay, so today we're going deep on something pretty interesting.
Yeah.
It's newsletter N degree 3 from MY.PATRIOTS.EUS.
Okay.
Now, this isn't just like your average everyday headline stuff. This
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
laying out some serious ideas
Hmm.
about a possible Euro-Atlantic confederation, like a whole
Yeah.
a whole project.
That's
It's
fascinating
fat-
stuff. We're really getting into like the foundational thinking here, the kind of big questions people need to be asking when you're talking about changing how nations relate to each other. Like this, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and for everyone listening in, that's what we're doing today, unpacking these, early considerations about how such a confederation would actually be structured and the principles that would guide it.
Exactly.
All right, so
Let's jump in.
let's dive into the first major theme that pops out of this newsletter, and
Yeah.
it's tagged with hashtag dissemblable, and it's all about embracing difference. They're talking about a confederation made up of distinctly dissimilar European and American nations.
Right. And what's so interesting here is that instead of seeing those differences as like a problem or a barrier,
Mm-hmm.
they're actually starting by saying this heterogeneity is a key feature.
Hmm.
The newsletter actually poses a really fundamental question right up front for all of us to think about. How can we structure a confederation respecting this heterogeneity, that diversity, while ensuring effective governance?
Wow.
So it brings up this immediate challenge of balancing diverse interests and approaches within a unified framework.
It does, and it also makes us think about precedents. Are there existing models, either historical or, happening today,
Mm.
where diverse entities have managed to work together effectively
Right.
while keeping their own distinct character? What can we learn from those examples? Both the ones that worked and the ones that didn't.
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting. You think about like historical empires or modern federations.
Yeah.
Some have really thrived on that diversity, and others have just fallen apart under the weight of their own internal divisions. And this newsletter seems to be suggesting that the differences between Europe and America, those cultural and political differences, could actually be a source of strength, offering a wider range of perspectives and innovations.
A whole new way of looking at it instead of saying everybody's got to be the same to work together.
Exactly.
Right now, the second critical theme the newsletter dives into, it's got a little more weight to it. Safeguarding identity and preventing despotism. Hashtag despotism. And, that brings up some serious concerns.
It really does.
Yeah.
If we connect it back to this idea of a confederation,
Mm-hmm.
what the newsletter is really highlighting here is a potential danger.
Hmm.
The risk of authoritarian tendencies creeping in,
Yeah.
or attempts to impose a single uniform culture that could actually erase the very diversity they were celebrating in the first theme.
Right.
Here, despotism seems to refer to the potential for a central authority to become too powerful and suppress the unique identities of member nations.
And they ask this directly. What institutional and legal mechanisms should we implement to protect local identities and prevent despotism within our confederation? What parts of that question stand out to you as most important?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the emphasis on both institutional and legal
Mm-hmm.
is really crucial.
Okay.
It suggests they're thinking beyond just good intentions
Yeah.
and really considering the actual structures and rules needed to prevent overreach.
Yeah.
For our listeners out there, this probably resonates with the importance of checks and balances in any system of governance, right? How do you actually build in safeguards to prevent any one part of the Confederation from becoming too dominant and potentially undermining the identities or freedoms of the others?
Exactly. And that really speaks to a core tension in any union, How do you create a shared purpose and effective collective action without crushing the individual identities and unique characteristics of the members? For our listeners who value their own backgrounds and identities, this idea of preserving those local identities within a larger framework is something I bet you can all connect with.
Absolutely. And it's a natural progression from that first theme,
Right.
having established how important it is to embrace differences. The newsletter then moves on to this crucial question of, okay, how do we prevent this very diversity from being suppressed by potential power imbalances?
Mm-hmm.
It's about making sure that the strength of the Confederation comes from the contributions of its diverse members, not from forcing them into a single mold.
Right. Okay, so let's get into the third idea. This feels like the most ambitious and maybe even radical proposal in the whole newsletter, marked with hashtag remembrement.
Right.
They're envisioning a confederal reorganization or even a European Unison State. That's a huge leap.
It is, and they frame this pretty radical proposal as a response to current global challenges. So they're not presenting it as just a theoretical idea, but as a potential solution to those really pressing issues that individual nations might have trouble addressing effectively on their own.
And the core challenge here seems to be that classic balancing act between national sovereignty,
Right.
that idea of independent nations having the ultimate authority,
Yeah.
and the need for effective collective action within this unison state. How do you see those two ideas interacting?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the newsletter asks this directly. What would be the advantages and the obstacles of such a confederal reorganization? It forces us to really think about the practical realities. What benefits could a more unified European entity actually offer in tackling things like climate change, economic stability, or security?
Right.
But then on the other side of the coin, you have to weigh that against the potential drawbacks, what parts of national identity or independent decision-making might be compromised or even lost.
For you listening, think about those trade-offs. Would a more integrated structure actually be better equipped to handle those large-scale global issues?
Yeah.
And if so, what might individual nations have to give up to achieve that level of unity?
And the term itself, European Unison State, that's intriguing unison, implies this harmony and unity, but they're proposing it within a confederal structure, which usually means a less centralized form of government compared to a federation or a unitary state.
Huh.
So there's this tension within the terminology itself. It suggests they're aiming for a really unique model,
Right.
something more integrated than just a loose alliance, but maybe less tightly bound than, say, the United States.
Wow, that's fascinating. Why do you think they might have chosen to frame it that way?
It could be a way of signaling a desire for greater cohesion and coordinated action while still respecting the individual sovereignty of member states. They might be envisioning a system where nations pool certain resources and decision-making powers for specific shared challenges, but keep significant autonomy in other areas. It really highlights the complexity of trying to create a new political entity that respects both unity and diversity.
It does sound like they're trying to navigate a delicate balance. So to recap everything for our listeners today, this newsletter from MY.PATRIOTS.EUS lays out three main themes for this potential Euro-Atlantic Confederation.
Yeah.
First, how to embrace the differences between nations while still making sure things run effectively. Second, the need to protect local identities and prevent any slide towards despotism.
Yeah.
And third, that more radical concept of a European unison state trying to balance national sovereignty with the demands for collective action in our globalized world.
Exactly. And it's important to remember for everyone listening that these are presented as initial questions and considerations,
Right.
not as fully formed proposals. It's about laying the groundwork for a much larger conversation and exploration of what's possible.
Right. This newsletter really shows how any huge political project like this needs that kind of fundamental philosophical thinking from the start. It's not just about the practical details of treaties and institutions. It's about the core principles and values that would underpin the whole thing.
It highlights that ongoing challenge of building collaborative structures,
Right.
especially across continents and different political traditions, the tension between unity and diversity, between the need for common purpose and respecting individual identities. It's a theme that keeps coming up in human history.
Yeah,
And this newsletter is grappling with those questions in a new context.
absolutely. So as you go about your day, take a moment to think about that balance between unity and diversity in any collaborative effort you're part of,
Yeah.
whether it's a project at work, a community initiative, or even within your own personal relationships. How do we best navigate those tensions to create both collective strength and a deep respect for individual identities?
It's a fascinating question to ponder.
It is, and it's one that will continue to be debated and explored as we move forward. Thanks for joining us today,
Thanks, everybody.
and we'll see you next time.
See you later.